A handwritten note sits folded in a leather portfolio. July 17th, 1945. Potsdam, Germany. A former haberdasher from Missouri is about to meet the man who won the war, and neither knows this moment will poison the Western alliance for years to come. This is the story of how Winston Churchill's contempt for Harry Truman created a rift that nearly cost the West the Cold War. July 16th, 1945. The Sicilian Hof Palace. Harry S. Truman walked through marble corridors that still smelled of fresh paint and German tobacco. His shoes, plain black Oxfords from a Kansas City store, clicked against stone floors where Prussian officers had once marched. The sound echoed. Too loud. Too American. He felt it. Truman had been president for exactly 94 days. 94 days since Franklin Roosevelt died and left him a war, an unfinished peace, and a secret weapon that could end human civilization. He'd spent most of those days learning what Roosevelt had never bothered to teach him. Now he had to face the men who'd actually won this war, Stalin and Churchill, and pretend he belonged at their table. The British delegation arrived first. Truman watched from a second-floor window as motorcycles cleared the road. Then came the Rolls-Royce limousines, black and gleaming like beetles. Churchill emerged from the center car. Even from 50 feet away, Truman could see the performance, the deliberate pause, the hand on the walking stick, the cigar raised like a scepter. The Prime Minister wore his siren suit, that one-piece jumpsuit he'd made famous during the Blitz. On Churchill, it looked like a uniform of destiny. On anyone else, it would have looked like pajamas. Truman straightened his tie. It was a plain blue tie. His suit was plain too, a Missouri tailor, not Savile Row. He'd bought it himself with money from his Senate salary. The difference mattered. He knew it mattered. The handshake happened in the main hall. Churchill's palm was soft, manicured. His grip was firm but performative, like he was posing for a painting that hadn't been commissioned yet. "Mr. President," Churchill said, and even those two words carried weight. The Oxford accent, the theatrical pause, the subtle emphasis on Mr. instead of something grander. "Prime Minister," Truman replied. His Missouri twang cut through the marble acoustics like a saw through silk. Churchill's eyes flickered. Just for a second. Truman caught it. He'd caught that look before, in Washington drawing rooms, at Georgetown dinner parties, even from some of Roosevelt's old advisors. It was the look people gave you when they'd already decided you didn't belong, and they were being polite about it. "Franklin spoke of you," Churchill said, and the use of the first name was deliberate. Franklin, not Roosevelt, not the president. Franklin, my friend, my equal, my partner in saving the world. The subtext was clear. I knew him. You didn't. "He spoke highly of you too, Prime Minister." "Did he?" Churchill's eyebrows rose. How extraordinary. He so rarely spoke of such things to— a pause. To everyone. The first session began at 5 o'clock. 23 men around a circular table designed to eliminate hierarchy. It didn't work. Stalin sat flanked by Molotov and military advisors who looked like they'd been carved from Siberian ice. Churchill commanded the opposite arc with Anthony Eden and a cluster of Foreign Office mandarins whose accents could cut glass. Between them, Truman sat with James Burns and Admiral Leahy, feeling exactly like what Churchill thought he was, a Midwestern politician who'd stumbled into history. The agenda was Poland. It was always Poland. Stalin wanted a communist government in Warsaw. Churchill wanted free elections and Britain's honor intact. They'd gone to war for Poland, after all. Truman wanted to understand what they were actually arguing about beneath the diplomatic language. Churchill spoke first. He spoke for 47 minutes. His voice rolled through the chamber like thunder through a cathedral. Perfect cadence, classical references, historical precedents stretching back to Caesar. He quoted Gibbon. He invoked Marlborough. He made the case for Polish sovereignty sound like the defense of Western civilization itself, which in his mind it probably was. When he finished, he looked at Truman. Not directly, that would be too obvious, but his eyes moved across the table in a way that clearly asked, "Can you match that?" Truman spoke for 8 minutes. He used short sentences. He cited facts, not history. He mentioned the Yalta agreements, the promises made, the obligations pending. No flourishes, no theatrics, just the plain truth as he understood it. The room was silent when he finished. Churchill leaned back. His cigar had gone out during Truman's speech. He didn't relight it. Instead, he turned to Eden and whispered something that made Eden's lips compress into a thin line. Truman didn't need to hear the words. He could read the body language. The slight shake of Churchill's head, the gesture of dismissal, the theatrical sigh. The British Prime Minister had expected to work with another Roosevelt, sophisticated, educated elite, capable of matching him reference for reference and stratagem for stratagem. Instead, he'd gotten a former shopkeeper who talked like a county commissioner and thought geopolitics was a matter of keeping your word and doing what you said you'd do. That night, Truman wrote in his diary. His handwriting was plain, each letter carefully formed the way they taught him in Independence grade school. Churchill gave me a lot of hooey about how great my country is and how he loved Roosevelt. I'm sure we can get along if he doesn't try to give me too much of soft soap. The soft soap was already flowing. Over the next 4 days, Churchill deployed every weapon in his diplomatic arsenal. He tried charm, long stories about the war, inside jokes about Roosevelt, invitations to private dinners that Truman politely declined. He tried intimidation, correcting Truman's historical references, explaining obvious points as if to a student, sighing dramatically when Truman asked practical questions. He tried manipulation. On July 19th, Churchill arranged a private meeting to discuss the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project was complete. Truman had been briefed. The test in New Mexico had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. A flash of light that turned sand to glass and created a mushroom cloud visible for 100 miles. Now they had to decide whether to tell Stalin. Churchill's position was clear. Tell Stalin nothing. Use the bomb to end the war with Japan, then use the threat of the bomb to contain Soviet expansion. The atomic monopoly was leverage, perhaps the only leverage the West would have against Stalin's armies. Truman listened. He nodded. Then he said, I'm telling Stalin we have a new weapon. Not the details, just that we have it. Churchill's face went rigid. Mr. President, I must counsel. I know what you must counsel, Truman interrupted, but I'm not going to lie to an ally, even an ally I don't trust. This isn't about lying. This is about keeping my word, Truman finished. That's what this is about. Always has been. Churchill stared at him. In that moment, Truman saw something shift behind the great man's eyes. Not respect. Churchill would never respect someone he considered beneath his class, but recognition. The recognition that this plain-spoken Missourian couldn't be charmed, couldn't be intimidated, and couldn't be managed the way Roosevelt had been managed. The contempt deepened. And if that moment revealed something crucial about their relationship, consider what you've learned so far. Drop a like if these hidden stories of power and pride are worth telling, because what happened next would shape the entire Cold War. On July 21st, Churchill tried a different approach. He went around Truman. He approached Burns privately, suggesting they work out the real agreements between those of us who understand how these things are done. He cornered Admiral Leahy during a dinner break, reminiscing about Roosevelt's vision for the post-war order. A vision, Churchill implied, that Truman couldn't possibly comprehend. He even attempted to use Stalin. During one session when Truman proposed a straightforward voting procedure, Churchill turned to Stalin and said with theatrical exasperation, "Perhaps Marshal Stalin and I, having more experience in these matters, might draft a compromise?" Stalin, whose contempt for aristocracy ran deeper than any ocean, looked at Churchill with those dead eyes and said, I think President Truman's suggestion is simple and clear. Why complicate it? Truman said nothing, but he filed it away. Churchill had tried to humiliate him in front of the Soviet dictator, and Stalin had taken his side. The irony was sharp enough to cut. The Poland question never got resolved at Potsdam. Neither did the question of German reparations, or the future of Eastern Europe, or the governance of occupied territories. Every issue deadlocked because Churchill and Stalin played for empires while Truman played for principles, and the three games couldn't find common ground. But one moment crystallized everything. It happened during the final dinner, July 24th. The delegations gathered for toasts and final pleasantries, the diplomatic equivalent of shaking hands after a boxing match where everyone lost. Churchill rose to offer a toast. He spoke about the Grand Alliance, the partnership that had defeated Hitler, the special relationship between Britain and America. Then he raised his glass specifically to Roosevelt, who understood that leadership requires education, sophistication, and a deep knowledge of history's lessons. The room went quiet. Every person there understood the insult. Churchill hadn't mentioned Truman once. He'd toasted a dead president while the living one sat 3 feet away. Truman's jaw clenched. His hands resting on the white tablecloth didn't move. But Admiral Leahy, sitting beside him, saw the knuckles go white. When Churchill finished, Truman stood. He raised his glass. His voice carried none of Churchill's theatrical richness, but it cut through the silence like a blade through butter. "To the victory we've won," Truman said. "Not because we were educated, not because we were sophisticated, but because we were right, and because when you're right, you don't need to be fancy about it." He drank. He sat. The silence stretched for 5 full seconds. Stalin laughed. It was a short, barking sound, genuine amusement from a man who rarely showed any. He raised his own glass. "To being right," he said in Russian, and drank. Churchill's face could have been carved from the same stone as the Sicilienhof Palace. The conference ended the next day. Churchill flew back to London, confident he'd return after the British elections to continue managing the peace. Truman flew back to Washington, knowing exactly what the Prime Minister thought of him, and not caring nearly as much as Churchill assumed. 3 days later, Churchill lost the election. Clement Attlee became Prime Minister. The man who'd saved Britain during the Blitz was out of power, rejected by the people he'd led through the war. Truman sent a polite telegram of congratulations to Attlee and condolences to Churchill. He never mentioned how fitting it seemed. The aristocrat who couldn't believe a common man could lead had been replaced by a Labour government committed to exactly that principle. But the poison remained. Churchill spent the rest of his life believing Truman was a lightweight who'd squandered Roosevelt's legacy. He said it privately to friends. He implied it publicly in his speeches and memoirs. The special relationship he'd touted was special only when America was led by men Churchill considered his equals, which meant men of his class. Truman, for his part, built the post-war order Churchill had thought him incapable of understanding. The Marshall Plan, which Churchill initially opposed as too generous to former enemies. NATO, which Churchill dismissed as unnecessary, while Britain still had an empire. The Truman Doctrine of containing Soviet expansion, which Churchill later claimed credit for inspiring, though he'd mocked Truman's version as simplistic when he first heard it. Every success proved Churchill wrong. Every achievement drove the wedge deeper, because Churchill couldn't accept that a man from Independence, Missouri, a man who'd failed as a shopkeeper, who'd never been to Oxford, who wore plain suits and spoke in plain language, could be one of the most consequential presidents in American history. The contempt poisoned everything it touched. When Truman needed British support for Korea, Churchill's conservative opposition fought it, citing his behind-the-scenes doubts about American leadership. When the CIA and MI6 needed to coordinate against Soviet intelligence, old Churchill loyalists in the British services slow-walked cooperation, remembering their hero's assessment of the American president as not of the same caliber. The special relationship survived despite Churchill, not because of him. In 1951, Churchill returned to power. He was 77 years old, slowed by strokes and age, clinging to past glory while the world moved on. Truman was still president. They met again in Washington. The same handshake, the same polite words. But the warmth Roosevelt and Churchill had shared was gone, replaced by the formal courtesy of men who knew they'd never like each other. Churchill tried once more to explain how things should be done, how the atomic bomb should be used, how the Soviets should be handled, how Britain and America should coordinate their policies. Truman listened with the same patient expression he'd worn at Potsdam. Then he explained what America was actually going to do, which bore no resemblance to Churchill's suggestions. The old lion flew home, diminished. Truman left office in January 1953, his approval ratings in the basement, his reputation savaged by opponents who called him a failure. He went back to independence, to a house without Secret Service protection, to a life of walking to the post office and answering his own phone. No speeches at universities that hadn't given him a degree. No memoir advance worth millions. Just a former president living on his army pension, because he refused to cash in on the office. Churchill, watching from London, probably thought it confirmed everything he'd believed. The little man from Missouri had flamed out, just as expected. History had other ideas. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next story of how small-minded pride changed the course of nations. Because what happened after both men left power reveals the final truth. By the 1960s, historians began reassessing Truman's presidency. The Marshall Plan had rebuilt Europe. NATO had held the line against Stalin. The Truman Doctrine had contained communist expansion without starting World War III. Korea was messy, but South Korea survived. The atomic bomb had ended the war with Japan with fewer casualties than an invasion would have caused. Every decision Churchill had questioned turned out to be right. Every policy he'd considered simplistic had worked. The lightweight had built the architecture of Western victory in the Cold War, and he'd done it with exactly the plain-spoken pragmatism Churchill had despised. Churchill's own legacy grew more complicated. The great war leader had been a mediocre peacetime prime minister. His cherished British Empire collapsed on his watch. His economic policies failed. His attempt to reassert Britain's great power status ended in Suez, a humiliating defeat that proved Britain could no longer act without American approval. The empire he'd fought to preserve vanished. The order Truman built endured. But Churchill never admitted error. In his final years, writing his memoirs and shaping his legend, he barely mentioned Truman. When he did, it was with faint praise that damned through omission. Truman had done his best and meant well. The same words you'd use for a well-intentioned amateur who'd stumbled into a job beyond his competence. The contempt was permanent, immortalized in 6 volumes of memoirs and countless speeches. Churchill had decided at Potsdam that Truman was inferior, and no amount of contrary evidence could change his mind. Truman characteristically was more direct. Asked by reporters in 1960 about Churchill, he said, "He was a great war leader, one of the greatest, but he thought he was still fighting the Napoleonic Wars, and that America should follow Britain's lead because we were too crude to understand the finer points." Well, we understood them fine. We just didn't agree. Pressed on whether Churchill's contempt had bothered him, Truman shrugged. A man who judges people by whether they went to the right schools or talk with the right accent isn't a man whose opinion I need. I had a country to run, and a war to end, and a peace to build. I didn't have time to worry about whether Winston Churchill thought I was classy enough. But he had worried. The diaries and private letters prove it. The slight stung. The condescension burned. The constant sense that Churchill was waiting for him to fail, expecting it, even hoping for it, never quite faded. What sustained Truman was simpler than Churchill could have understood. He believed in keeping promises, in doing the right thing even when it cost you politically, in treating everyone the same whether they were presidents or janitors. Those weren't aristocratic virtues. They weren't educated or sophisticated. They were just American virtues, carried by a man who'd never pretended to be anything he wasn't. Churchill couldn't see that. His class consciousness was too deep, his education too classical, his self-image too bound up in the idea that leadership required breeding and culture. The notion that a former shopkeeper could outperform him, could build a more durable peace, could leave a more consequential legacy. It contradicted everything he'd been raised to believe about how the world worked. So he didn't believe it. Right up until his death in 1965, Churchill maintained his private assessment. Truman had been lucky. The real architect of the Cold War strategy had been others: Atchison, Marshall, Kennan. Truman had simply signed what smarter men put in front of him. The irony was perfect. Churchill, who'd spent his life accumulating knowledge and culture and connections, couldn't recognize wisdom when it came from the wrong zip code. The man who'd rallied Britain with speeches about fighting on beaches and never surrendering couldn't understand that sometimes strength comes from Main Street, not Whitehall. History kept score differently. When Truman died in 1972, historians ranked him among the great presidents, not despite his humble origins, but because the qualities that made him successful were exactly the qualities Churchill had despised. His plainness became clarity. His lack of sophistication became directness. His refusal to play diplomatic games became principled consistency. Churchill remained great too, but his greatness was bounded. He was the perfect crisis leader, the man you wanted when bombs were falling and survival was at stake. But he was the wrong man for peace, incapable of adapting to a world where American economic power mattered more than British imperial tradition, where democracy meant more than aristocracy, where a haberdasher from Missouri could shape history as profoundly as any Oxford graduate. The lesson was harsh but clear. Contempt is expensive. Churchill's inability to see past Truman's background cost Britain influence, weakened the Western alliance, and gave Stalin room to consolidate his empire while the democracies bickered. The special relationship survived, but it survived wounded, requiring decades to heal from poison injected during 5 days in Potsdam. And Truman? He went to his grave knowing he'd been right. Right about Poland, right about the atomic bomb, right about containment, right about NATO, right about the Marshall Plan, right about everything Churchill had doubted. He'd been right because he'd been simple enough to see the truth when sophisticated men were blinded by their own cleverness. Because he'd been common enough to understand what common people needed when aristocrats were playing games of empire. Because he'd been uneducated enough to ask basic questions when the educated men were too impressed with their own knowledge to question their assumptions. The former shopkeeper had beaten the Oxford graduate at the great game, not through cunning or culture, but through character. And that was the one victory Churchill could never acknowledge, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that everything he'd believed about class and breeding and the natural order of things was wrong. So the contempt endured, frozen in memoirs and speeches, passed down through generations of British establishment figures who repeated Churchill's assessments without questioning them. Embedded in the mythology of the special relationship as a kind of original sin, the moment when Britain's greatest war leader met America's common man president and decided fatally and finally that common wasn't good enough. They were both wrong in the end, and both right. Churchill was right that Truman lacked sophistication. Truman was right that sophistication was overrated. Churchill was right that Roosevelt had been a more compatible partner. Truman was right that compatibility mattered less than getting the job done. But only one of them built something that lasted. Only one of them created institutions that would outlive empires. Only one of them proved that in democracy, common sense beats refined taste. Plain speaking beats eloquence, and keeping your word beats knowing which fork to use. That man wore plain suits from Missouri, and Winston Churchill spent his last years unable to forgive him for it. The poison they brewed together at Potsdam, part Churchill's contempt, part Truman's wounded pride, diluted over time but never fully disappeared. It shaped how Britain and America worked together in the 1950s. It influenced how both countries approached the Suez Crisis. It colored Cold War strategy in subtle ways that historians are still untangling. Two men met in a German palace in July 1945. One believed leadership required breeding. One believed it required character. They were both giants of their age, and they couldn't stand each other. History sided with the haberdasher. The marble corridors of Sicilienhof still stand, preserved as a museum to that moment when the Grand Alliance cracked. Tour guides tell the story in 3 languages, explaining how Stalin and Churchill and Truman divided the world. They mention the tensions, the disagreements, the failed compromises. What they rarely mention is the look in Churchill's eyes when he shook Truman's hand, the subtle condescension in his voice when he said, "Mr. President," the careful way he invoked Roosevelt's name like a weapon, the deliberate exclusion during that final toast. They don't mention it because contempt is harder to preserve than policy, because personal slights seem petty next to the sweep of history, because we prefer our great men to be above such things, motivated by principle rather than pride. But history happens between people, not between nations. And sometimes the most consequential moments aren't the policies debated or the treaties signed, but the instant when one man decides another isn't worthy of respect and spends the rest of his life proving himself wrong. Churchill and Truman taught us that lesson at Potsdam. One taught it through his inability to see past class. The other taught it through his refusal to let contempt define him. The world they made together, despite each other, was stronger for both lessons. But it could have been stronger still if pride hadn't poisoned the well where democracy's defenders drank. That's the secret message that changed the Cold War. Not a telegram or a memo or a classified document. Just the unspoken words in a handshake, the meaning beneath a toast, the contempt that neither man could voice but both men felt. Churchill thought Truman was beneath him. Truman proved Churchill wrong. And the West won the Cold War using the plan of the man in the plain blue tie, not the man in the siren suit. Sometimes history's greatest ironies are also its simplest truths. The little man from Missouri was bigger than anyone thought, and the great man from Britain was smaller than he appeared.